Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Dunstan Thomas webinar on the role that pensions can play in assisting the growing number of baby boomers who want to continue subsidising their children, grandchildren, and other family members in retirement. I'm Adrian Bolding, Director of Retirement Strategy here at Dunstan Thomas, and it will be my pleasure to chair today's event for the next hour through to our conclusion at 1 o'clock, which we manage promptly as ever, cognizant of the fact that many of you have given up your lunch hour to be present with us today. I'm joined today by two esteemed panelists to lend their considerable wisdom and experience to our discussion. Jessica List is Pensions Technical Manager at Curtis Banks. Over a 10-year career at Curtis Banks, Jessica has specialized in helping financial advisors with queries and in writing technical content for Curtis Banks and the trade press. Jessica's razor-sharp analysis will help us understand what's possible within the current pension rules for helping the next generation, both in terms of what can be done now and what can be planned in terms of eventual death benefits. Jeannie Boyle is Executive Director and Chartered Financial Planner at EQ Investors. Jeannie joined EQ in 2008 as a technical consultant and since 2010 has been a director of the firm. Jeannie is a Chartered Financial Planner, a Fellow of the Personal Finance Society, and in 2015 won Money Management's Ethical Financial Planner of the Year award. She appears regularly in national and trade media outlets discussing personal finance issues. At EQ Investors, Jeannie pays particular attention to the advice process, ensuring that clients remain at the heart of their business. Now, throughout last winter and spring, Dunstan Thomas have been undertaking a major piece of research into the financial habits of the baby boomer generation, those who are now aged between 58 and 75. In many ways, this makes them the most interesting generation for those of us who work in the financial services industry. Quite simply, they have most of the money, and they're going through a period of fiendishly complicated change as they transition from full-time work to part-time retirement and on again into full-time retirement. So we set about both quantitative research and with an extensive questionnaire backed up by qualitative interviews as we hit the streets of London, Liverpool, and Bristol. A particular finding for us this time was the strength of the desire to continue to provide financial assistance to their children and grandchildren. As Sir Walter Scott said 200 years ago, blood is thicker than water, and the desire to help the family remains unbounded today. 1/3 of all baby boomers anticipated continuing to support their children financially in some way, even after they have retired and were drawing their pension. When you reach state pension age and retire, you stop paying national insurance, you stop paying your union dues, you stop paying your professional subscriptions, but 1 in 3 don't stop paying for their children. And this number is a marked increase to the survey work that Dunstan Thomas did with baby boomers 5 years previously, where that number was just 1 in 5. Something has changed attitudes during these 5 years. At least in part, I suspect that is down to house prices, which are up 31% over the last 5 years, with the price of an average house now standing at £289,000, according to the latest Halifax numbers. In many areas of retirement, things come down to those that have the money can do, whilst those that don't cannot. The PLSA Retirement Living Standards, derived by Loughborough University from discussions with groups of members of the public, show that those with the comfortable level of income will replace their car every 5 years, while those on only moderate income will wait 10 years. But reflecting that blood is thicker than water quote, at Dunstan Thomas we found an inverse relationship, and those on the lowest income levels expect to continue subsidizing their children for the longest period, on average for over 21 years into their retirement. Out on the streets of Liverpool, we met a 72-year-old lady whose son had married a Croatian girl, And over a long period, she's helped them buy a house in Croatia, paid the kindergarten fees for their granddaughter, paid for summer schools and trips back to the UK, and now she's paying her granddaughter's rent while she studies at Zagreb University. The lady smiled broadly as she told us, I like buying her treats too. At Dunstan Thomas, we believe strongly in equality and inclusion. People of all ages, genders, sexual orientations, and ethnic origins should be treated equally without fear or favour. But we also believe in diversity and that different people will bring their own contributions that enrich the multifaceted tapestry of human life. So we ask those questions in our research. Asian respondents were most committed to helping their children in retirement more than any other ethnic group. A total of 57% of Asian respondents reported that they were or were planning to subsidize their children even though they themselves were fully retired. Importantly, though, asking those questions, research questions, also reminded us not to stereotype people. For example, we found that 18% of our LGBTQ plus respondents will be financially supporting their children in retirement. Financial support is not just about money cascading down the generations. 7% of baby boomers were supporting their own parents. On an average, this period lasts for 7.5 years into retirement. The sandwich effect, where baby boomers were supporting both their own parents and their own children, was most prevalent between the ages of 62 and 66. Of course, support is not always financial, and 1 in 5 baby boomers were providing unpaid care for a family member, typically either grandchildren or their own parents. But we shouldn't equate unpaid with free, as it comes at opportunity cost. Out of those providing care, 5% are doing this for 30 or more hours a week, almost the equivalent of a full-time job. Yet many baby boomers want to work. This was another notable increase since our previous study, with today 71% of baby boomers wanting to be in paid work, either full-time or part-time. We'll be publishing the full results of our baby boomer research project later in the summer, so look out for that, please. But for now, we have clear evidence that even deep into their own retirement, people want to be providing financial help to their children and grandchildren. This will need to come from their two main assets, their pension and their house. I'm going to pass you over to Jessica List of Curtis Banks now, but before I do so, can I just remind you that on your screen is an Ask a Question button. This button enables you to do two things. You can either type in your own question, or you can vote for questions already submitted by other audience members. As always, when we get to the questions, we'll be prioritizing those with the most votes. So please be active and submit questions and vote on the questions that others have submitted. And now for a few introductory thoughts, I'll pass you across to Jessica List of Curtis Banks. Jessica.
Thanks, Adrian. So Adrian mentioned there that, of course, one of the key things that people will be using if they do want to subsidise children and grandchildren is their pension. So I'm going to just talk a little bit around the pension rules and sort of what that might look like and some of the considerations there. So thinking about the current rules first, unfortunately, with DC pensions, actually the most flexible and tax efficient way in which funds can be sort of passed to the next generation is through death benefits. Of course, death benefits can be completely income tax free, although of course as that's primarily down to the age at which someone passes away. That's not necessarily something people can sort of fully plan and control. Of course, once someone passes 75 and they know that the death benefits are going to be taxable, of course, that can be taken into account. And of course, on the other side, there will be situations where, unfortunately, someone does fall ill and has a degree of certainty that they will die before 75 and those benefits will be tax-free. But it's not something generally that people can, concretely plan around sort of many years in advance. So the main is flexibility and sort of planning around with DC death benefits is around beneficiaries having beneficiaries drawdown. Now, beneficiaries can be in a position where they can end up with money that is still benefiting from all the tax advantages of a pension wrapper, but with full flexibility. So there's no minimum age for beneficiaries to withdraw money that's in a beneficiary's drawdown account, and without affecting their own pension savings. So there's no money purchase annual allowance trigger for taking money out of beneficiaries drawdown. It won't affect the beneficiary's own lifetime allowance, so it can grow without that in the back of their minds as well. So there is a lot of flexibility there, and of course it is a very important aspect of planning, but that doesn't really help with this idea of grandparents actually wanting to assist children and grandchildren during their lifetimes and in a way where they can be involved with that. So from a pension benefits perspective, I think this is another area where the pension freedoms potentially offer sort of some opportunities there. So for example, if grandparents are expecting to need or want to use more funds earlier on in their retirement, so perhaps when the grandchildren themselves are younger and maybe there are more costs involved, maybe when the sort of parents in the middle generation are younger and sort of less financially stable or well off themselves, or potentially if it's just when the grandparents themselves are younger and maybe want to be more actively involved in some of these activities, so want more money to support that. This is another example where the pension freedoms can allow people to use more of their funds up front and then take less out later on. But of course, that comes with the same flip side, the same warning that comes with all discussions around ways to use the pension freedoms flexibility, in that, of course, that comes with the risk of those grandparents then withdrawing too much too soon and ending up struggling themselves later on in their own retirements. So another consideration from a pensions point of view is the tax. So, of course, if people are already taking pension benefits, already using that for income, if they do want to take those larger payments out, maybe to support grandchildren with larger costs, so maybe house deposits, weddings, things like that. Of course, the tax and the income tax is a consideration. They could then be pushed into the higher brackets. So that's something they wouldn't necessarily have the same thought around or the same problem around if they were, for instance, taking money out of an ISA to support a payment like that. So tax and income tax is of course an element when it comes to taking money out of pensions for this purpose. So thinking a little bit more hypothetically, I suppose my thoughts go to sort of what could be done to sort of change or support this. So if we continue to see this sort of trend with subsidisation and with the, I suppose, intergenerational inequalities that are now being quite widely reported in a lot of contexts, what could be done to change pensions to support that? So I suppose a few maybe hesitations to begin with. My thoughts firstly go to the fact that, of course, DC pensions are already very flexible, and there are already a lot of conversations around the complexities of managing that, so particularly for unadvised consumers, and the sort of challenges of making sure that they can use those funds efficiently and understand how to make them last retirement. So we don't necessarily want to suggest ways of changing those rules to make it even more complicated. I think as well as this shift from DB to DC continues, we will see more and more people who are wholly reliant on their DC savings for their retirement income. So what we also wouldn't want to do necessarily is find ourselves in a system that sort of encourages people to take money from their pension and use it for future generations, when that might have more of an effect on their own life if they don't have that sort of underlying DB income to sort of underpin everything. That said, if increasing intergenerational fairness and being able to support money filtering down to younger generations sooner does become a sort of key policy issue, a key goal, something that wants to be supported, and I think it's possible to imagine some quite sort of creative ways in which the pension rules and pension system could support that. So, for example, you can imagine perhaps rules that allow tax breaks if people are using their pension funds to help other people with their pension savings. So for instance, if a provider was paying out income to a client, that goes through tax as normal. But if they're asked to transfer money directly from that pension into a grandchild or a child's pension, that would be income tax free, something like that. Perhaps ways of donating allowances. So for example, if older people had already saved, already completed their pension savings, were still having their annual allowance. So it's rather than keeping it as carry forward, almost maybe a carry across, where that could be donated to someone else for them to increase their own savings. Or even with death benefits, perhaps something like the tax situation being based on the beneficiary situation rather than the, I suppose, donor's situation. Now, particularly, I suppose no ideas are original, but particularly that last one, I will hold my hands up and say that is based on something that's very well publicised, suggestions for IHT reform at the moment. So the idea being that if you have someone's estate and that is taxed, the tax is the same regardless of whether you're passing that funds to someone who's already a millionaire in their own right, or whether you're passing it out to 50 basic rate taxpayers. Whereas actually, if you taxed the recipient of that money, or the recipients of that money, then that would perhaps encourage people to disperse wealth among a larger number of beneficiaries, or sort of less well-off beneficiaries as well. And then you're not only being able to get that the sort of subsidisation, but helping to sort of combat some of the inequality as well. Now, of course, those are all very high-level thoughts and ideas. It goes without saying that with all of those types of things, once they're very carefully thought through, you need to iron out the unintended consequences that we very often see with sort of pension rules tinkering. And of course, some of those, are more related to, you said, the sort of inequality and spreading wealth generally, rather than the, I suppose, day-to-day subsidisation. But you can imagine that if these sort of policy aims do change, there are some quite creative ways in which pensions could fit into a wider framework there as well. So, thanks very much, Adrian. I'll pass back to you.
Jessica, thank you for that. We can see a couple of questions coming in already, so do please keep those coming. But before we move to questions, we will go across to our third panelist, and let me introduce Jeannie Boyle of EQ Investors. Jeannie.
Thanks, Adrian. So as you said there in your introduction, like most financial planners, the baby boomer generation makes up the biggest cohort of our clients, and retirement is generally the biggest trigger point for someone seeking advice in their life. Hopefully they come to us a few years beforehand, but quite often they end up at our doors just as they're about to finish up work. And as we work through planning scenarios with these clients who are thinking about their retirement and talking about the things they want to do, help for adult children and grandchildren comes up very frequently. And Adrian, you touched on the reasons for that, and I think we're all kind of familiar with the pressures that the younger generation are under. House prices, I think, are now about 7 times average wages. Private rental takes up 36% of a single person's income. It's much, much harder now for younger people to get established. And on top of that, you've got education costs as well. And when I was thinking about my own clients who are at and near retirement, what really struck me was how young some of them are, or how young some of their children are. So I was thinking about one of my lovely clients who's age 61 and has just retired from work. She was made redundant, but her two children are both still at university, and they're going to be needing help for the next few years. One of them's just decided she wants to do a law conversion course, which was slightly unwelcome news. But it means that we have to think through in our planning support for children for much, much longer than we may have thought that we were going to. And at the point in life where some of our baby boomer clients might have been hoping to be spending money on travel and the fun things they've been dreaming of for a long time, we need to work out how we can also support their children through these crunch years where they have high education and housing costs. The other factor that we need to think through are the boomerang generation, as they call them. So I think the stats are that 2/3 of adults between 20 and 34 have either never left home or have come back again to live. And we saw this effect increase during the pandemic when young people left their flat shares in London to go back home and live with mum and dad, somewhere hopefully a little bit roomier and with a little bit more outdoor space, rather than being cooped up with their flatmates for months on end. And we see it with clients often. There is this feeling amongst perhaps the younger generation that they should be able to go back to the parental home at any point during their life. And it's wonderful, and clients, obviously want to provide that support for their children, but it can make planning difficult. I was working with a couple recently who were planning to downsize, but their child, I'm calling him a child, he was 30, was in a very unstable profession, and they felt they needed to keep hold of the family home to have a place for him to come and stay from time to time. So those things that people thought they might be going to do, they're finding that actually they don't have as much flexibility as they perhaps previously thought because of their children. And the years, some couples I've worked with have got quite used to having an empty nest and find that actually having their adult children dropping back in for months on time, it might actually be preferable to give them a great big lump sum of money to buy a house and just go. So all of these things that we have to factor into our planning with clients. Now, the other end of the spectrum, we've got grandparents who are quite often helping with school fees. And again, school fees are something that have run way ahead of inflation over the last few years. And if you look back maybe 20 or 30 years ago, your maybe average upper middle class professional like an accountant or a solicitor or a doctor would expect to educate their children privately. If you're paying $15,000 a year for day school, that may not be possible if you've got two children. And more grandparents are looking to support children through the education that they gave to their own children. Obviously, there are tax implications around all of these things. And one of the big questions, as Justice alluded to, is how best to use pensions and other assets to make either regular or substantial gifts. And we often used to find that people would look to their pension commencement lump sum, their tax-free cash, to support these things. And the changes to pension freedoms mean that that's maybe not the most efficient way to do things anymore. So part of the work that we're doing now is looking at different assets that people have available to them to work at the most tax-efficient way to gift from pensions or from other assets. And the other big question that we're trying to answer is around affordability. And again, Adrian, you said that those who can least afford it are actually providing the longest and most support. So these are the people who really need help understanding what is possible with their pensions and their other assets in retirement. And we know now that a lot of the people who are using income drawdown and pension freedoms to draw their own income without advice are probably drawing more than they can sustain over the long term. I've seen figures quoted as high as 5%. Some people are saying 3.6%. I think it varies from people to people, person to person. But what we can see is that there are unsustainable income withdrawals happening across, particularly around non-advised clients. And part of the role of financial planning is to help solve some of the big questions like, can I afford to do this? And for me, it's increasingly difficult to answer these questions without looking holistically at a client's whole asset spectrum, and doing this on an iterative basis every year, so we get a constant understanding of what's possible this year and next year and the year after that, because these things will change and demands on clients' income and assets will change over time. And part of our role is to answer that big, will I be okay? Can I afford to do this? And I think the big challenge that we have as financial planners is how can we help work with the clients who can perhaps least afford that service and who are most in need of it. And I think this is where we're perhaps looking to providers and other people within the industry to help us provide these solutions and services that don't cost thousands of pounds, that comes working with a full financial planning service.
Jeannie, thank you very much. Okay, so two great contributions there from Jess and from Jeannie. We have some questions coming in, which is fabulous news. A quick comment back to Peter Ginger. We are recording the event, and therefore you will be able to download it afterwards. For those of you that want to have a download or to share it with friends, do please vote on the questions that are coming in, and we're going to start with this one, which has got 2 votes so far, which is about should inheritance tax thresholds on passing boomers' homes into direct descendants be scrapped to stimulate property wealth transfer to the next generation. So, a question there around these currently very generous inheritance tax thresholds. You've got a total relief of up to £500,000, or if there's a couple, you can double that, and it's a million. Jessica, can I come to you first about IHT thresholds? Are they too generous?
I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I suppose there's the argument around how long they've stayed the same, other than the the property sort of addition in recent years, which would suggest it would maybe need to go up. But on the other hand, I suppose for a lot of people, this is still a lot higher than maybe their estates and things will get to. I think the property question is really interesting because, as we know, that house prices are soaring. So whether that sort of figure within that sort of works with the way property prices are going. But on the other hand, I think the question there is around sort of the fact that actually, if you're sort of including that and people are keeping the property to pass it on, is that having an effect on the housing market as well? It's a really difficult one. I don't know, Julia. We probably see more from an advice side of things on that one.
It is a hard one. So there is you can downsize your property and retain the main residence nil rate band for some of the money that's been released. Whether or not that particular allowance is good policy, I mean, personally, I think it's terrible. I think if you're going to have an allowance of £500,000, it should be for any asset left to anybody. I don't understand why property wealth warrants this exemption that perhaps cash doesn't. I think when you look at the government's levelling up agenda, I don't see how giving this exemption, which will largely apply to people living in London and the South East, works in tandem with that. I think what's really interesting from a planning perspective is I find more and more of my admittedly very wealthy baby boomer clients feeling that they should pay some inheritance tax, and feeling that actually things have not universally but been quite favourable for many of them, and they want to make a contribution to the public finances. They want to help other people. I'm generally talking about people who've already been able to help their children through their lifetimes, and feel that they should give something back. There's a big division about whether they should do that via charitable giving, or whether that should come through, not from kind of ignoring inheritance tax planning. It used to be something that we'd turn to quite regularly as financial planners, but I'm finding that's less and less the case with some of my clients.
Gee, that's really interesting, and it's certainly something we see amongst the sort of the super wealthy. The billionaires rather than millionaires, who have been, vocally calling on the government to tax them more. I have a slightly strange view on inheritance tax, that I kind of think I'd be quite happy to pay inheritance tax, because I'd rather pay the tax when I'm dead than pay other taxes when I'm alive. And it sort of starts from a basic principle that I support the things that the government spend our money on. I like the fact that they spend lots and lots of money on the health service and on education and on maintaining the roads and all that sort of thing. So I like what they're spending my money on, and I kind of feel that actually, because I enjoy spending my money, I'm happier if they take it from me when I'm dead than that they sort of took out a higher rate of income tax while I was, drawing my pension and things. But there we go. But I'm encouraged to hear that, avoiding the inheritance tax is not absolutely the be all and end all for your clients, Jeannie.
Yeah.
Now, Yep.
I was just going to go on and say, I mean, in theory, if you're a married couple, you've got £1 million allowance, you potentially got a pension that you're leaving free of inheritance tax as well. That's pretty generous as allowances go. And I know not everybody agrees, and some people feel that they're paying tax twice. But as you say, if you're a fan of schools and hospitals, roads and all of those good things, there is a point where we have to pay into that.
Yep. Lovely. Okay. I go back to our list of questions. A super question is coming from James Martin, asking us to think about care costs, which are spiraling and increasing. Can really people be earmarking pensions for their IHT planning, or really is that they need to retain them as an insurance policy in case they incur, care costs. Jeannie, I wonder if I could go first to you, because presumably when you're sort of sitting down with clients, are you able to raise the slightly uncomfortable question about what happens when they're a bit dementia and, can't manage the stairs anymore and worse, and need to sort of head into a care home and things?
Absolutely, it's a huge planning point, and making consideration for these costs is vital to any successful financial plan. I think it's probably slightly easier to raise that with the baby boomer generation, because quite frankly, many of them are going through it with their parents, or have been through this journey of helping their parents as their health declines, and dealing with things like powers of attorney, care homes, and the costs that were involved. And I think once you've been through that experience and perhaps seen the quality of some of the care, that puts the frighteners on most people who want to make good provision for their own later life care. However, again, a lot of people are quite comfortable with the idea that their property can be used to cover that. I'll caveat that by saying that we're often planning sort of 20, 30 years in the future, and it's very easy to say, oh yeah, that's coming down the line, I'm not going to worry about it now, and you can take my property. And it's a very different emotional decision when you're actually closer to the time.
Yes, I think you're spot on, and I think people kind of maintaining this hope that they might get back to the property and recover a bit and return. It's a very difficult thing to say. Jessica, from a sort of tax efficiency way, are there some ways that are more efficient in paying for care costs than others?
Yeah, so the question was they're asking about sort of using the pension as almost the insurance sort of policy on the back of that. I think it's interesting, I suppose, behaviourally how that ends up sort of like being factored into the planning. I can't recall the statistics off the top of my head, but I think there is that saying that actually it's quite a small number of people who end up paying very large care costs, and quite a lot of people actually don't maybe end up spending quite as much as you sort of fear from headlines. So it seems like in terms of using the pension to plan around things, it has more of an effect maybe on people's behaviour, because as you said, as I think was implied in the question, people maybe don't want to either spend the pension or plan on passing as much on, because they don't know if they're going to need that money or not. So I think I've also seen statistics relatively recently around the effect that has on people. So perhaps in this case, a lot of boomers who maybe still do have parents who are currently in that position where they don't know how much they're going to need to pay. It's the effect on people thinking, I might get some money, I might be having inheritance coming, but actually we don't know yet, because we don't know what those care costs are going to be, don't know how much is going to be left. So do I now spend more of my own pension income, thinking at some point I'm going to be receiving a windfall and it will balance out? Or do I actually need to not spend my own income and very much save my pension, spend less than I think I can afford to, because I have no idea if that money is going to come through? I think in terms of tax efficiency, I suppose it comes back to those sort of same questions that we see time and time again. Do you spend your pension first, or actually is that one of the last assets you look at because it's got that inheritance tax, or most likely got that inheritance tax protection? Do you draw down on other assets first? So I think that probably fits into that sort of same wider question. Of course, there are actual insurance policies and things for paying for care, but those aside, I think it probably fits into the similar areas that we see in other cases as well.
Yes, I think there's an important sort of parallel with the intergenerational points that we're making. There's a old proverb, be kind to your children, because it's your children that will be choosing your nursing home. And the sad reality is that for most elderly people, by the time they need to move into a nursing home, it is normally their children that will do the research work and the legwork, and will run around and find a home which has got a space and that is within their budget, and effectively make that choice for them. So yes, keep your children sweet while you're going along. Okay, I want to move on and look at another one, and we have 3 votes for a question which has come in from Ben Stafford. And Ben is saying most DC pensions are accessed without advice or impartial guidance. Forgive me a minute because the thing just shifted on me. First being used, what measures do you think are needed to engage non-advised savers? Jeannie, could I head to you on that one?
Yeah, that's it's a good question, and I think clearly there's no appetite to reverse pension freedoms. I think that this is here to stay. I think we need to be stronger around making sure that people get guidance. I think there's more we can do around services like PensionWise to make sure that people are getting some help at that point where they are drawing money from their pensions. I think there is a lot we could do around making available some more basic cash flow planning software to clients who are at retirement and without an advisor. I think the thing that's really hard for most people is understanding the longevity of themselves. Most of us live longer than we think we're going to live. I often hear clients say, "Oh, don't worry about my late 90s, I'll be dead by then," when statistically they probably won't be. And building that connection with our future selves, which is so hard for us to grasp sometimes. And I think cash flow planning and the software that we use as planners is really powerful for doing that. I would like to see something more widely available for people without advisors in a very simplistic way to make sure that they're not drawing too much from the pension.
Oh, I think that's a super idea, Jeannie. You know what really frightens me is that we go through sort of 40 years of working life, and at no point in my working life have I ever had an employer that's asked me, how much would you like to be paid this month, Adrian? And the moment you retire and flip into income drawdown, that's exactly what your pension fund does. They start writing to you and saying, well, what would you like to take this month? Much or as little as you want, sort of thing. And people are, as you say, sort of sorely ill-equipped to be able to make those decisions. I kind of think it would be really great if pension schemes had a recommended level. Obviously, the individual has freedom, and they can, adjust that and take more or less depending on what they wanted to. Schemes I've talked to have mostly sort of raised their eyebrows and not terribly frightened by that. But I've had some joy talking to, trustees who said that maybe within a trust-based environment, where clearly they don't have any commercial axe to grind and can't be accused of telling people to consume, too much or too little in order to somehow maximize the drawdown provider's own fees or thing. In a trust-based environment, they might be up for that, and maybe that will come. Now, on this question, I want to come to you, Jess. And Niaz has asked a follow-up question on that, which is around the stronger nudge, and whether that is having any sort of desired effect, or whether we need an even stronger nudge towards PensionWise. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on stronger nudge and PensionWise and all of that.
So I think it's probably fair to say I've been relatively vocal about my thoughts on the timing with the stronger nudge. I appreciate that there were some sort of constraints in the legislation and what PensionWise was required to do around that, what the FCA was required to do around it. But ultimately, that nudge comes when most people will have decided that they want to access their pension. So I think if we do want to increase take up of PensionWise and encourage more people to think about getting more good quality information from good quality sources before they retire, we do need to get people earlier. We do need to be thinking about how to best contact people before they've made that initial decision, because ultimately it's written into the rules as when people have provisionally decided, but ultimately when most people contact their provider, they have decided. It's not a sort of initial dipping a toe, can you tell me about my options? It's, can you give me the form of I've made the decision. Now, I think the other big aspect or big challenge, I think what you sort of almost touched on there, Adrian, with sort of almost where it's coming from, because unfortunately research has repeatedly shown that if it is your provider turning around and saying you might want to think twice about how much you're taking out or how soon you're taking it out, was the natural, I suppose, sort of caution for people is, well, you would say that because it's in your benefit for me to leave my money where it is and for you to keep collecting fees. So I think we do need to think, I think there is a lot of merit in providers sometimes being able to give more information and, as you said, Adrian, some of them may be ideas about what sustainable income looks like or how to even go about thinking about how much you need and want from your pension. But there is a limit at which, or a point at which, just behaviourally, people will naturally be cynical about information given to them from a provider if it goes against what they were thinking about doing themselves, because they do start questioning whether it's genuinely sort of objective information or whether it is the provider trying to encourage you to do something that's in its own best interest. Now, of course, we know from a regulatory point of view, providers will get in a lot of trouble if they started trying to make clients do things that were just in their interest. But you can understand that that's quite a high hurdle to come over from a consumer point of view, even if you know that there are those sort of regulatory requirements in place. So I think there's a couple of quite big challenges there within what we're currently doing and the existing framework to sort of get the right information out there, but also in a way that people will want to listen to and will trust.
I think that's a really good point, Jess, in that it sort of comes back a lot to financial education and lack of sort of basic understanding of what pensions are and how they work. I mean, one of the things that we see repeatedly is people taking their tax-free cash as soon as they can get their hands on it and parking it in the bank account, and thereby sort of excluding themselves from any investment growth over the next few years. And I think if people in this country had a better understanding of how investments work, how pensions work, and how compound interest works, we could improve financial outcomes significantly and prevent that sort of, as you say, people distrustful of providers, and sadly distrustful of advisors too in some circumstances, and stop this sort of feeling, right, I'm 55, I'm going to take some money out of my pensions because it's my money and I'm just going to put it over here in a bank account where it's not earning any interest at all, which is just so detrimental to well-being later on.
Yes, yeah. Let's hope people wake up to that, because with inflation having taken off now, I think the latest CPI is 9, and your bank might be paying you, 1.5 if you've really shopped around and tried hard to get a good account. That's 7.5% a year that your money's purchasing power is just being eroded by. Jeannie, I wonder if I could ask you as an advisor. Presumably, you have clients come to you sometimes that have been to PensionWise and sometimes that haven't. From an advisor's point of view, is it a useful preparation for them, or is it frankly getting in the way of what you want to be telling them?
I don't think it's necessarily getting in the way. I think anything that's providing information is useful. I'm just trying to think of an example of a client who's come to see me after going to see PensionWise, and I'm struggling to think of one. I think possibly when you're dealing with slightly higher net worth clients, their first impulse is to get advice rather than to use that service. I think possibly one of the problems with PensionWise is that you might be going to see them about one pension, and then you need to go and see an advisor to deal with the issues around consolidation and trying to deal with probably the multiple pensions that you have over your working life. But no, I don't think I've ever sort of found that it's got in the way.
Brilliant. Lovely. Okay, let's have a look on at the other questions we've got that are coming in. And the one with the most votes is coming from Sam. Sam, thanks for asking the question. It is, if the rules change, is there a risk that pensions would end up not being primarily for retirement income, but more for passing money on to the next generation? Jessica, rules, if we change rules, are we in danger of making pensions more of a sort of passing the money on thing rather than a retirement income vehicle?
So I definitely think there's a balance to be struck. I think we're already at the stage where that's been raised as a question. So ahead of the pension freedoms rules and the big changes that came in for death benefits then, there was a question raised there about whether there was a risk that those rules would make DC pensions, an IHT planning vehicle rather than a retirement income vehicle. So I think there would be some people out there that would argue that we've already sort of tipped that scale a little bit. Now, I think at the moment, while we're still in a world where a lot of people will have DB as well as DC, you could argue that there are probably a lot of people out there who have the DB, who have the other resources, and the DC pension has now sort of become something that they can look at from IHT. But that's people that were already there, and they weren't thinking about that necessarily when they were originally saving into that DC pension. Whereas if we're talking about people that are saving now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people now, that DC pension is going to be their only source of retirement income, or their only pension. So if people are primarily relying on that DC pension for their retirement income, we're probably swaying back towards, well, actually, even if the death benefits rules are very generous, people are going to need that source of money. They're not going to have the option necessarily to leave a large DC pot entirely untouched and use other sources if they just haven't got them. So I think there could still be a balance to be struck, because of course there will always be people that are wealthy enough that they can just use that DC pension and have plenty of other sources, whether it's a DB pension or just other sources of income for retirement. So there probably is still just a balance to be struck to make sure it's not open too widely. But I think it's a problem that actually, as that shift to DC happens, might sort of counterbalance itself just by necessity.
Yeah. Jeannie, I wonder if I could ask you to comment a bit on what you've seen for this shift from moving from DB to DC, because over the last 20 years, we have seen quite a material shift in our DB environment. Of course, it is an asset that belongs to the pension scheme itself, and you as a beneficiary get an income, but it's solely within the rules of the scheme. DC, it's sort of, very much more something that's yours. It's something where you've got much more control and flexibility over, particularly since the pension freedoms. Do clients now have a sort of attitude, it's my money, I'll do what I want with it, more than they used to, perhaps?
I think that attitude has always been present. I think that and pension flexibility is the ability to use pensions for inheritance tax planning has driven a lot of the DB to DC transfers that we've seen over the last few years. And I think for a lot of very wealthier clients, the ability to move out of a DB environment into a DC environment as part of their overall inheritance tax planning has certainly driven that market. Is it true to say now that people have more sense of self and identity and less sort of collectivist thought? I think possibly yes. We have this notion of individual responsibility and individual freedom that's been very present in all of our thinking, I think, since probably the 1980s. And this idea that what is ours and we should have control over it is a natural part of our thinking. I think that has changed how people think about their retirement and or their retirement funds, and increasingly looking to break links between employer schemes and their own sort of personal pension. The idea of a SIP, having a SIP is almost like a badge of honor, I think, for some people, because it's mine. I think it's an interesting sort of philosophical point about our sense of self in society that has changed.
Yes, that's interesting. I wonder whether that pendulum will just start to swing back the other way a bit now, because 1st of August this year marks the launch date for the new collective defined contribution schemes, which are very much more about a collective enterprise of a group of people trying to manage their retirements together. Maybe they will flourish, and maybe that pendulum will swing back a bit. I certainly hope they do flourish personally. I'll move us on, and Holly King has asked us around the subject of equity release. Is equity release going to be the answer to help baby boomers boost their retirement income and potentially set more of it aside for handing on to their children or grandchildren? Is equity release going to take off more? Is it taking off already? Which of you would like to give me a comment on equity release?
I'll bounce that entirely to Jeannie. My equity release knowledge is not so good.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Equity release, I think, for many people is part of the solution. It's, when you think about it, if you're sitting on an asset that's potentially worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, trying to eke out a dwindling DC pension, it makes total sense to use that, particularly if you are looking to help the younger generation by gifting money earlier rather than later. I think we can't ignore this huge source of wealth that's present on most people's balance sheets. I think for most people, their it has unwelcome associations from things not being done well in the past. But I think as we see this boom in house prices, and people, work so hard to pay off their mortgages, and have such, these properties are such a huge source of wealth and struggle throughout our lifetimes. It makes sense to use that rather than going without. I think we need to make these products easier, I think, to access within parameters. But obviously, I think they should be advised. I think we need to see more emphasis on providing regular income. Going back to your point earlier, it's quite difficult sometimes to manage great big lump sums that arrive suddenly in your bank account and all the planning that goes around with those. So I think there is a lot of work that can be done around equity release to make it simpler for people to use. I know Tom McPhail wrote a paper on this recently, which I thought was really interesting. And he's quite right that as planners, we need to be taking into account property wealth as part of our overall thinking.
Yes. I'm left here thinking, gosh, this is a product, we've been waiting for 20 years for its time to come. I kind of think that the sales are on the up now, and that it is coming. And I think it's a sort of matter of the sort of stars all coming together, that we're beginning to have people come through to retirement with inadequate pensions, so they probably are therefore more interested in eating into the house. The house prices have gone up, relentlessly, with 31% up on where we were 5 years ago. My children are out trying to buy houses at the moment, and they keep saying, "Oh, if I don't get it quick, it's gone up by next month." So it's terrifying for them. And it's a huge source of wealth that people are sat on. So let's hope it comes. There seems to be more providers coming as well, and that in part technically there seems to be a technicality that you can usefully put an equity release portfolio together back to back with a bulk buyout of a final salary scheme. So it's no accident that the big players in equity release are also the big players in the bulk buyout of DB schemes. And there's plenty of those DB schemes that are still to come to market to buy out. So I think there's a good supply coming for some years to come in that marketplace, which is great news. Now, Louisa asks us a fabulous question, which is that, I mentioned that these baby boomers want to work on. It was a clear facet that came through from our research that they want to. Some are working on. Quite a number of the ones that we met out and about on the streets were feeling, quite aggrieved that although they wanted to work on, they'd been pushed out of work by their employers, and were struggling to find sort of something suitable. Lou asks us, well, why is it that more of them, want to, work on longer? I don't know, whether either of you two could, offer me an opinion on that.
I think, I think work is central to our identities. It's central to who we are. Giving that up permanently and full time is a big step to take. And I think for a lot of people, losing that sense of identity and purpose is quite scary if you don't have something very definite that you want to go on and do. So I think there's quite a lot of emotional stuff going on around giving up work. I think the thing that we've noticed over the last couple of years is actually working has got a little bit easier. Now we don't have to go into offices and commute on busy trains and all of that kind of rubbish that made it a bit grim before. So why not keep going a few days a week if you can, and you can do it from home, and just go into the office for the nice social occasions. It makes work a lot more pleasant, and we're seeing increased numbers of people who might have been retiring now actually putting that off a little bit, because it's got a bit easier. So you can keep the nice facets of work, including the income, rather than carrying on with the daily grind.
I think it's quite nice to see in some of the studies that have been coming out around, sort of the pandemic and the effect on work, that most of the ones I've seen at least seem to show that there's at least as many people that are wanting to work longer because they want to work longer, not because they have to because of problems with saving for retirement. I suppose whether or not that continues, I suppose remains to be seen. But I've found it, so quite encouraging in a way that it isn't just that people want to work longer because their finances are terrible and because they're worried about saving for retirement or their income. It does seem that in a lot of them, a lot of people, as you say, do want to work, and maybe so being put on furlough or losing a job during the pandemic made them realise that actually they aren't ready and they would like to carry on working. And as you say, Jeannie, there's a lot of more flexible options out there for a lot of people as well now. So yeah, aside from, of course, the problems you mentioned, Adrian, around maybe older people sometimes struggling to find new jobs and employment, there are lots of flexible opportunities out there as well, I think, to be found.
Yep. I think that's a really good point, the furlough one. Now, one of my jobs put me on furlough for a period during the pandemic. It didn't take very many episodes of Homes Under the Hammer to know that actually I would much rather be back working than set a name on furlough. So if that was a kind of trial for early retirement for me, then no, it's not for me. Thank you very much. I'm still very, very active in the pensions area. We've got time for probably one more, I suspect. So let's see. Top of our list is a question: do we think that IHT pension death benefits reform is likely to happen soon? Jess, I'm going to come to you first on that one, if that's all right.
Yeah, so it's certainly true. There've been a lot of reports, and I think a lot of discussion over the last sort of maybe 12 to 18 months around IHT reform. And I think hand in hand with intergenerational inequality and whether both of these should be sort of tackled at the same time. I think my main view is that if you do change the IHT rules sort of to encourage certain behaviours and pensions don't follow suit, they risk becoming a way of almost circumventing it. So if you did, for instance, have these IHT rules that encourage people to sort of disperse wealth further and among a greater number of poorer beneficiaries, pensions might go from being one of the few ways that you can do that at the moment to actually one of the few ways that you can just pass it on to one wealthy person without any penalties. So I suppose my main view is that I think if there is big reform coming, it is likely to affect both, because I think you have to build that system to make sure one doesn't become a way of circumventing the other.
Yeah. Jeannie, if I could ask you a question that's related to that. I've had a number of people suggesting that stamp duty is a problem in terms of passing wealth on, and that maybe what we really need is some stamp duty reform, so that if a pensioner wants to downsize and buy a smaller property, then actually that is a beneficial thing they're doing for society in terms of releasing some of the larger housing stock, and maybe they should therefore be given some sort of incentive, or perhaps not charge the stamp duty on the smaller property they're buying. And I just wondered whether stamp duty comes up as something which your clients raise with you if they're discussing the sort of pros and cons of downsizing versus actually release versus just staying in their larger home.
Absolutely, stamp duty is a barrier to people downsizing, and I think it's one of the reasons that when people sometimes add up the numbers on downsizing, they're not ending up with as much in their pocket as they expected. So you take into account stamp duties, fees, and maybe you don't really want to leave the area that you live in currently, and you want to keep a spare bedroom for your son who's decided to be a theatre director or whatever it is, that you don't actually end up with as much profit as you think, and that's the reason that some people don't go ahead and do it. So I think removing that barrier would certainly be welcome and hopefully help free up some housing stock and maybe stimulate the market at that end. Not that the housing market needs much help at the moment, but that may change in coming months.
That's brilliant. Jeannie, thank you very much. Well, we're coming up to the end of our hour now. Perhaps I could just draw people's attention to our next webinar. There's a flash button at the bottom of your screen that enables you to register. The next one, because we're taking a break for the summer month, is going to be back with us on September the 29th. We'll be looking at the subject of income strategy in retirement, as Jeannie mentioned earlier. It can be a bit of a challenge when suddenly a very large sort of lump sum drops into your bank account. It's the same issue in pensions. Suddenly a large amount of money gets vested in your SIP. How on earth do you turn that into an income? So we'll be addressing that issue of income strategy and retirement on September 29th. Do please, register. We'll be here on Crowdcast in our usual way, in our usual 12 till 1 slot. We have now reached 1 o'clock, so it is time for me to thank our two panelists for giving their time, Jessica List from Curtis Banks and Jeannie Boyle from EQ Investors. Thank you very much to the two of you. Thank you also to our audience for coming and sharing your lunch hour with us. Thank you for posting the questions, and thank you for voting on the questions. As you'll see, I have endeavoured as far as possible to, look and address the ones at the top. So thank you very much for all of us from coming. Thank you from Dunstan Thomas, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheerio all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.